Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael B. Casey, and this is my talk on speculative Bitcoin adoption price theory, which is basically this. This is what we're going to be talking about here today. The nature that is this GIF. So this is the actual piece. It's a Medium article I published, and this is what it looks like. I'm only going to be showing you pictures and doing a lot of talking here. This uses a lot of big words. I'm probably not going to. So zoom up on that. This is me. I'm Michael B. Casey, as opposed to this guy, Michael J. Casey. I am the second most famous Michael Casey in the Bitcoin space. This guy is actually a Wall Street Journal reporter, and he has published 2 books, The Age of Cryptocurrency and The Truth Machine. His writing's very, very good. So, glad to have another namesake. I'm at the Black Marble. It's my Twitter handle. And the stuff I'm going to talk to you about largely was published on December 27, 2016. I wrote it a little, like 2-3 weeks earlier. It says it's a 10-minute read, but it probably would take me longer. So it kicks off with this. This is the provisos section of the paper. So this is just a theory. It may be completely wrong, in whole or in part. Anything that I'm saying. This basically what I'm saying could be completely full of it. So take it with a grain of salt. As always, do not invest anything more in cryptocurrencies than you are prepared to lose in totality. This is just a good rule to live by. Maybe one day when all this stuff is flushed out and it's money that's everywhere and the price is completely stable, then yeah, maybe don't worry about it. But until then, just assume you're going to lose everything. Not really. This paper is not really about Bitcoin, but about crypto in general. I say this in the provisos as like a one-sentence thing. If I had the paper to do over again, I probably wouldn't have called it Bitcoin. I would have said cryptocurrency in general, because it's my belief really that there's only one massive cryptocurrency market, and things move around a little bit in it, but the whole thing rises and the whole thing falls largely as one movement. And it was also written when Bitcoin had 90% dominance. So basically the only thing anyone ever talked about back then was Bitcoin, which was only a year ago, which is kind of hard to believe. Ethereum was around, but it spiked up and went back down. And it was written before hard forks of BTC existed. So at the time, that was assumed that this was an impossibility. Bitcoin could never hard fork. It would be the end of everything. So it also assumes near universal adoption of crypto. And that's definitely up for debate, but I don't talk about it here. And this could be either, base layer crypto or through tier 2 like Lightning Network or sidechains. It doesn't matter as long as everybody's using crypto, or practically everybody. So the theory, simply put, is the growth of adoption of Bitcoin, and therefore Bitcoin price, is following an S-curve of technological adoption, which itself is characterized by fractal repeating, exponential increasing Gartner hype cycles. Everybody gets that, right? Perfect sense, right? I didn't understand it either at first. So let's go through all these elements, right? So the first one, we'll start with the S-curve technological adoption. This is the bell curve of adoption. Anybody who's ever taken a marketing course of any kind has run across this. You start with the innovators over here. When, if you take any technology, or any product. So say HD TV when it first came out. So, or 4K now, right? So you have people who pay a lot for these screens that are practically useless because there's no content or anything for it. And they cost an insane amount. Those are the innovators, the ones who actually push the thing forward. And there's a very, very small part. Then you have the early adopters. Things have gotten a little bit easier to use, a little more user-friendly. Some prices have come down, usually in most cases of products. And so you get more people buying in. And then you got the early majority, which is up to half of the population, the late majority, and the laggards. Everybody has a grandma who doesn't own a computer, right? Or something like that. There's always going to be a laggard population where it slopes down. And then there's some people today who just still never even own a cell phone. So that's the normal bell curve of adoption. So you stack it in a cumulative fashion, you get a cumulative S-curve. So this is the exact same shape, only the yellow line is cumulative throughout the life of it. And you end up getting 100% when all the laggards have adopted. So it's characterized by, almost no movement at the very beginning, and then an exponential growth phase followed by a logarithmic taping off. And that's how technology grows. And it's not just me saying it. This, I totally scabbed this from the New York Times, so this has nothing to do with me. But you can see each one of these has that same S-curve of exponential growth that it hits once it starts to get to a certain level of adoption. Pretty much all of these were non-existent. They were around. I mean, if you look at the VCR, it was around here, but it wasn't until about here that it's actually even registered, right? And the biggest thing about these S-curves is they're actually getting faster and faster and faster. Technology adoption is speeding up. The rates at which things are growing is faster, and then we move on to the next thing. The one that's not on here that I always think about is tablets. Because you remember like the one year there were no tablets and then suddenly everybody has a tablet? It's like that now. So the other concept besides S-curves is the Gartner hype cycle. How many people are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle? Okay. So I'm using it in a completely different way of how it's ordinarily used and what it was designed to do. So in the Gartner hype cycle, you have a technology trigger, and then that rushes up with excitement and enthusiasm for this new technology, whether it's quantum computing or nanomachines or whatever. They say, yes, they're going to do everything. And then, it gets to a certain point, people dump money into it and realize, oh, we're nowhere near that. I mean, that's just not going to happen for a very, very long time. So everybody gets depressed and it falls down and all the money dries up and everything goes away. This is based on a concept called Amara's law, which is we tend to overestimate the effects of technology in the near term, and we tend to underestimate the effects of technology over the long term. So, and then it goes up the slope of enlightenment. That's basically us right here learning what does and does not work. And then the plateau of productivity is actual useful stuff. So it's no longer hyped up. So this is where all of the hype is. And this is, okay, nobody's super excited about it. It's just a thing now. This is, this is life with smartphones. Nobody gives a whoop about smartphones anymore. We all have them. It doesn't matter. Everything goes through the cycle, and this is what Gartner, the company that created it, was actually a guy, Gartner. There's now a company, Gartner, that actually rates technology and where they are on this scale. This is the July 2017 one. And I highlighted right here, blockchain. So blockchain is on the Gartner hype cycle, and it's past the peak. So according to Gartner, it's dying. So this is how it's traditionally used. You can see all sorts of different technologies, and you can see where they are in the hype cycle. And it's supposedly something technology only goes through once, a specific facet of technology. So it's a little blurrier, but this is a 2016. You also see blockchain here a year ago. So this was right before the peak of the hype cycle. And then if you look here, there is no blockchain in 2015. Didn't even exist back then, according to Gartner, but it had cryptocurrency exchange, which had already fallen. This is, of course, 2 years after Gox. So that's why they say that. But this is typically what Gartner hype cycles are used for. I don't use it like this. I just saw this pattern, and I said, hey, this pattern that I just keep seeing over and over again in Bitcoin? It looks a lot like a Gartner hype cycle. And I was like, wow, that's really, really interesting because you see the same effect. And it just, to me, it struck me as just very, very similar. And so you see here, there's this Gartner hype cycle over here. And then you get the equivalence. So the technology trigger, that's a bull run. So this is the event that triggers the massive increase. And a Bitcoin bull run typically is about a full order of magnitude increase, or 10x. So that's a big, big, big increase, 10x. Nothing really does that except for maybe pre-IPO unicorns. They get increases like that, but nothing else, nothing you can buy. And then it has the drop down. So this is they call it, they don't even acknowledge the drop in Gartner, but the trough of disillusionment. So this is the crash that comes from the peak. This is the height of irrational exuberance. And then it crashes all the way down to here, the trough of disillusionment, which represents itself here in the Bitcoin as I call it the boring low. Because this is a period here where it just sat here for a year and did nothing, essentially. It moved up and down by $100 over the course of, take a couple of weeks to move up, take a couple of weeks to move down. But basically, it did nothing for an entire year. And then it moves into the final phase, which is the volatilic rise, which is not a word. People will say, well, that's not really a word. I know, but it's the only thing I can think of to call it. Volatile doesn't seem to do it for me. So I coined it the volatilic rise. And it's basically stair-stepping at this point. It goes up and it goes down, but the net effect is always up. So it stair-steps up and then, levels out. Stair-steps up and then levels out. And it keeps doing this over and over again until it reaches the old high. Once it gets to the old high, well, suddenly, so people think that this is, right now, they think this is the actual value until the bull run happens. By the time it hits this peak, it is overvalued. So the things that cause a bull run to happen are FOMO, fear of missing out, and greed. Those are the two forces that drive pretty much any market movement, are fear and greed. So these forces cause people to buy and buy and buy because they're afraid of missing out and they're greedy for more, until it reaches such a point where now the people who bought in down here are no longer fearful that they're going to miss out. They're fearful that if they don't cash out now, it's going to drop and they're going to lose it. So when, the higher this goes, the more risk that happens. And then after the initial cash out, you see steady waves of people, okay, going down, okay, people go back up, oh, go down, come back up, okay. But the trend is that of a crash in the long term, all the way down to where it settles and becomes boring again. So, so that's the thing. So I described a little bit of a bull run. I think we've seen a little bit of one lately, so people may know what that's about. It was a lot harder to explain to new people back when I wrote the paper, because the last one that happened was 2013. Nobody cared. It was old news. So this is what, basically, the dramatization, this is what it looks like when a bull run happens. That's basically what it's like. And another interesting part is, and this wasn't in my paper, I didn't put it in here, but this is a very famous paper, visualization of the anatomy of a bubble. And you see this in almost every bubble that comes. And yes, these are bubbles. It's not to say that they're like, oh, Bitcoin is a bubble or crypto is a bubble and it's just going to collapse and never come back again. But it goes through bubbly cycles. It really does. So keep in mind, so the biggest thing about the peak, you'll notice that here is the bull trap. So it almost always does this. Whenever you see a huge bubble like this, it will fall and then it will increase and it'll look like, oh yeah, it's not really going down. It's just going to go back up by the dip. And then it falls down into the crapper. The other thing to notice about this, because it will eventually rise back up, and this is the end of the bubble. Bitcoin doesn't work like a normal bubble, because actually when this stage is over, it just peters out, and then eventually it repeats itself. So you'll see another one. But here's another thing that's very, very interesting. So take a look and note this bear trap right here. So the bear trap is another peak that is well before the main bubble that we're talking about. And this typically happens with all bubbles. It'll get a little bit of a movement up and down, and then the bubble forms later. So just pay attention and note that. It'll be important later. So we look at this here, right? So I talk about hype, because this is all hype driven, according to my theory, right? So how do you measure? How do you prove it's hype? I'm lazy and I didn't update this for the last peak. So this is the exact same one I used in my paper. But you can see right here, this is a logarithmic scale. $0 to $1. $1 to $10, $10 to $100, and $100 to $1,000. So you look at the first peak. This is Google index searches, right? So it uses a 100 down to 1 scale of what the highest value of it was, and that's 100, and shows everything relative to that. So they don't tell you exactly how many hits. It just gives you an idea of, well, is it over or under, right? So based on this, you can see whenever there's a huge spike, so this is no traffic, and then all of a sudden a huge spike up here correlated exactly, it's actually a little bit ahead of a huge spike, 10x spike in the price. And then the 10x spike though dived down, and then it came back up and was about where it was before. And then you see another huge spike in people searching it. So what this is actually a cycle. So it's a circular pattern on the way up. So people see the price rising. They get excited, right? So they buy in, and it reinforces that. The price then rises more. And then everybody sees the price rising. They say, what is this thing that's rising? And then they Google it and learn more. And then the Google rating goes up, and people say, well, people are paying a lot more attention to this thing. Maybe there's something there. And so they get interested, and then they buy, and then the price goes up. And then more people are interested, and it's just circular and circular all the way on up until it reaches a point until it's not anymore. And then suddenly it starts going the other way because, oh my God, then the narrative changes. Oh, it's overvalued. Oh, Bitcoin's going to die. Bitcoin's dying. It's dead. And you see this over and over and over again. There's an obit page for Bitcoin, something like 180 entries at this point. There have been literally 180 times in public, in writing, Bitcoin's been declared dead by public figures. And it's funny to me. But you can see clearly each one of these, and if we were to plot today, you would see the same thing right here. You'd see a huge spike that's actually much bigger than this one. The whole thing would go down in scale. And you would see another one. See, this is 100. It would be up to 20,000 from here. From the I got it directly from trends.google.com. You put in the term Bitcoin, and then I exported out the data that sources that, and then compared it in Excel against the Bitcoin price. But yeah, it's super easy to get. I'm just lazy. Okay, so fractal patterns. How many people here know what a fractal is? Cool. So fractals are awesome. Fractals are self-repeating mathematical, well, they're mathematical equations that are very simple, and this is a relatively simple, it's not a super simple mathematical equation, but you will agree there's not much actually written down there. But it evaluates to an incredibly complex phenomenon, like chaos theory and everything in there. And it's also self-referential. Fractals are really cool because life basically works off fractal. Like, you look at the amount of information that's in your DNA and the amount of information that's contained within you. And you think, well, it's impossible from something that simple to create something that complex. Well, basically how it does it is through fractals. And it's like, just think about trees too. So every time a tree grows, it actually forms a fractal pattern of the forks in the tree, which then fractally repeat themselves, and on and on and on until from one simple sprout you get a fully formed tree all the way down to the structures in the leaves. Because it's reusing the same, basically the same instructions over and over and over again, slightly changing them. But the whole point is this quote by Mark Twain here: history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Fractals are not exact copies throughout every iteration, but at each level, and this is orders of magnitudes up, they look the same. They're self-similar. So this is what the Mandelbrot set, the most famous fractal there is, looks like. And see it zooming in? You saw the initial shape? Well, there it is again at this layer. And it goes back down in. And I think you'll see it one more time. But this is just a visualization of the most famous fractal. And I can't sit here and explain to you, there it is again. I can't sit here and explain to you exactly what the fractal equation is that controls this stuff in Bitcoin, but it's very, very evident that something is there. So if you look at it here, this is the chart that I created when I wrote the paper. So the bubble in 2000, second bubble in 2013 here, right here, when it spiked all the way up from $120 up to $1,100 overnight, practically. It was actually over the course of a week. And then it was crashed back down to about $200, which was only double what it was at the peak here last time. And then it stayed there for a very long time, and then it started moving its way back up slowly. The reason it moves back up slowly is because the market has to shake all the weak hands out here. So now the only people here are basically true believers who aren't going to sell no matter what anybody says. I don't care what you say. And then they hold for so long enough, magically what happens is the price by this point has been steady so long, people start to pronounce it stable. Ironically, it's the fact that it's stable which destabilizes it and causes more people to buy. So remember when we started looking at that bubble chart? Well, remember early in the bubble chart I told you to pay attention to the bear trap? See this? In this context, this looks like a bear trap, but it's not. But it is. It's the bear trap of this bubble, but it's also its own bubble. So see what I'm saying by a fractal pattern here. You see this pattern, and we look, very similar pattern, huge spike, large crash, stays low, low, and steady increment, increment. And you see it back up over and over and over again. So these four phases repeat themselves. But each time they do, it serves as the bull trap for the next one. So this one here, if we actually rescale it, that's this over here, right? So this is what we're looking at here, compressed on a time scale. And it's compressed on a time scale in order to fit this one in. So this one actually started in July 2011. These two were, these two were actually 6 months apart. So we had two bubbles in the same year. Prior to that, this was a year and a half from 2011 to 2013. Practically no movement. And we look at that and blow it up, it looks like this. Are we seeing a pattern here? Huge spike, devastating crash, inactivity, incremental rise. So this is all the way back to 2011. Let's look at these. The spike at that time was up to $30, which at the time was mind-blowingly earth-shattering high. And we look, okay, here's the same thing again, and what do we see before it? Another one. Okay, let's look at this one. This one's a little bit different, right? This one doesn't have the telltale huge spike, but I think I know why. So remember, this actually spiked up. Before this, it was under 40 cents, and it spiked up to the mind-blowing amount of $1.05, which back then was unthinkable because it was a huge event. Bitcoin hit dollar parity, and I think that's why you don't see a huge spike up here. Because it hit dollar parity in everybody, because before that it wasn't real. Before that it was play money. All of a sudden it hit $1, and then everybody who had any bit of it, instead of just buying because it was going up, they sold because they said, well, this isn't really money, it's actually worth something, I'm getting out. And so people who had tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, when it hit $1, you literally had nothing. And now you have $100,000. They're literally nothing. It was play money. So many people sold that this was a smooth curve rather than the spike that we always see. And I think that was because $1 is such a massive psychological barrier. But if we go a little bit deeper, we see that spike up here, and we see before it. This is the first thing I could find on the sale of Bitcoin. So this is down, and this stretches earlier down to the 5-cent level. And it goes up here. And we see that spike again. This was a much smaller spike than as far as order of magnitude, but the same pattern right here. This is the earliest known record of a Bitcoin trade movement. We see the spike. We see the crash. We see, spend a little time recuperating, and then we see the rise. Now notice this one relatively was very, very quick. It was brief. This went from November 1st, December. So this whole thing is a span of 3 months. This whole thing. So they do change in time scale, but the pattern over the long term is always consistent. So this is all the stuff that I said in the paper. I wrote the paper a year ago. So what's new? What's happened since then, right? Okay, so let's complete this, which is the first slide I showed you of these charts. So when we last left, it was right here. And I predicted basically the cycle is going to repeat itself. So you look, it was right here at about 700. I wrote this actually in late November, so it was like 740 right here. We had another spike up, and then after that, this happened. So this is what happened from there. So again, this was right here that I did my writing. We saw this all the way up. So let's look at that. So this is the spike up. If you look at the peaks of it and only mark the low points of the action and do it, it's a perfect exponential curve. I mean, I've never seen anything that uncanny before. It's absolutely perfect. I mean, the same thing is actually true as if you take the top instead of the bottom. But obviously there's some volatility in it. But when it goes up exponentially until it ceases. This is not my work, but this is another example of somebody else who actually did very similar calculation. His was written before mine. I actually formulated this theory back in 2013, but I didn't write anything about it. This guy, he 2014, because you can see where his data stopped, he created this logarithmic scale based on his projection where Bitcoin would be. And so this hasn't changed since then, and you can clearly see it's actually been spot on right here. So January 2018, it has us right at $10,000, which is about where we were, give or take a week. But that's uncanny, given that the last time he talked about it was still under 1K. So if you follow the projection out, it's a pretty rosy scenario. It doesn't, according to what he puts, it never quite hits a million. But, you know, so if he says 100K Bitcoin, he says that's going to happen low about 2021. So food for thought. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to happen, but I do think it's on an exponential bent. That's the other thing. Is Bitcoin isn't necessarily the one that's going to win? Because like I said, I view this as crypto as a whole. So something could outshine or supersede Bitcoin, steal all its thunder. Bitcoin could have a fatal flaw in it, crash down to zero. If that's the case, I would expect whatever it is to continue this path and eventually end up, when it hits, about here, that means the price is practically going to become infinite as measured in dollars, because when that much money converts over into Bitcoin, the only thing that can happen is hyperinflation on the fiat side. So basically, as soon as it gets near that scale, everybody's going to be buying into this, and they're going to be dumping dollars, which is going to devalue the dollar, and not just the dollar, the yuan, the yen, the euro, all of the currencies all at once will enter a hyperinflationary period if this ever happens. So after this, you can't really measure it in dollars. You really can't. When it gets up to here, I like the term houses. I measure it in median income houses per Bitcoin is what I like to measure when it gets above that, because you can't really rely on a dollar metric anymore. So, but again, this is not my work. It's a great example. I don't like to use this personally just because logarithmic charts are scary, and if you screw it up just a little bit, you end up a couple order of magnitudes off. So I don't know, but I would be hesitant to take this projection literally, but at the same time, it's been pretty good so far. So this is actually from my paper too. I didn't edit it at all. So I named the bubbles, the ones that I just ran through, based on the date, the peak, the baseline, which is kind of an arbitrary measurement I came up with, and the baseline is actually it's where it is right before you see the bull run. So it's last stable time, but it's very, very arbitrary. So I named them after what you could buy at the peak. So 46 cents, that buys you an arcade game. $1.09 a Bitcoin back in 2011 would buy a candy bar. It's pretty sweet. 6/9 2011, $31.50. So that's a pizza night. You know what I mean? Couple pies. Yeah, and Bitcoin pizza. Obviously, that's why I put that there, because somebody paid 10,000 Bitcoins for a pizza once. So it's nice that you could buy just two of them with one Bitcoin right there. And then April 10th, 2013, we had a big one. I call that night on the town. So it peaked out the non-GOX price. This is very important because GOX actually got quite a bit higher. But it was $259 was where the non-GOX price peaked out. And I say that's enough to buy you a really nice night on the town. Get a couple people out for some drinks, see where the night takes us. And then the last bubble that we had before I wrote the paper, I call vacation, because that's $1,000. That'll buy you some resort time somewhere. So what's left, right? So there are three bubbles left that I see, two, maybe three bubbles. It all depends on how it goes. I call them car, house, and yacht. I can't tell you, but so back then, so the price was $700 when I wrote this paper. So I left it there as the baseline. Today, I'd probably put it higher than that, probably around $1,200 or so. If you look at the charts, really, where it looks like it hits the knee of the curve, it's really more about like $7,000, to be honest. But that's so much higher than the old high that I don't count it. Anyway, but a car, the height of that peak was a little shy of $20,000. And I think we'll all agree that'd buy you a decent car. We're not talking about a Rolls Royce, but it's better than a used Yugo. So the same thing holds true with house and yacht. I'm just using this as a rough guide for at the peak, this is about where it's going to be, order of magnitude. And again, I'm not 100% on this. This is what I believe. So now we're back to the beginning, and we're looking at the theory again, so I'll repeat it. The growth of adoption of Bitcoin, and therefore Bitcoin price, is following an S-curve of technological adoption, which is itself characterized by fractally repeating, exponentially increasing Gartner hype cycles. Do everybody understand that a little better now this time?
Yeah.
So that's it. Any questions? Yes?
2 questions. So where do you think we're on the adoption curve and the Gartner hype cycle?
Oh, the adoption curve and the Gartner hype cycle?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I figured that would come up. Let's go back. Wow, I have a lot of slides. Okay, so the adoption curve. All right. So where we are, when I wrote the paper, I said, and this all depends on how high the eventual total adoption goes, because this whole thing could fizzle out. We could be at 100% adoption right now. I don't think so. But assuming that we do have global, general, more or less adoption at some point, well, when I wrote the paper, I said we were right about here. So I would say we're probably right about here right now. We may have just edged over into the early adopters phase. As far as total global usage, if this thing catches on. And that's another very important point, was when we talk about the S-curve here. So we see these Gartner hype cycles, but all of these big movements that we see right now drastically pale in comparison to the final one. When the final one happens right here, it will be everybody that's left in the world suddenly adopting this all at once, like within a span of a year. Everybody on the planet will go from not using it to using it. And when that happens, it's gonna dwarf the exponential increase in here is gonna make the rest of this look like down here. Basically, what we're seeing right now is here. It's here. It's here. And when that final one happens, and that, like I said, is probably it's at least 1 cycle off, but probably 2 cycles off. So it'll be a while. And what was the other question? Where are we in the Gartner hype cycle? Oh, okay. So let's look at where we are right now. A lot of slides. Okay, so this is actually the most up-to-date. I pulled this yesterday. So we see the exponential increase right here. If you look at the Gartner hype cycle, it looks very clearly like we're pretty deep in the crash. So I would expect that to continue quite a bit. I don't know exactly how far, because the pattern as it repeats itself, it depends on how long and stretched out this is going to be before the next recovery, which I don't know. Because they vary, and there's really no way to tell how long each cycle is going to be when you're in it. It's kind of easy in retrospect. Look like, oh yeah, it's very simple to see. But when you're actually looking, it's very hard to tell exactly how low it's going to go. But we are definitely in the crash. I would say probably about, well, halfway down the crash, which is it's lost half its value. But the big thing is we actually may see yet another. Remember the bull trap that I talked to you about, where it spikes up again? We could potentially easily see another one of those that spikes up, but not as high as the peak, and then crashes further. Well, no, I mean, there could be multiples, believe it or not. So this could be viewed as a bull trap here, but that may not be the only one. There could be a larger, longer-term bull trap. And it's impossible to say what it's going to be, but I think I'm very bearish right now. I think we're in a downward trend, and I think, quite frankly, it's healthy. We need to consolidate. We need to shake out. So what the process of the crash is actually shaking all the weak hands out of the market. During this crash, it scares the shit out of people. This is why I tell people never to put in any money you're not willing to lose. Because if you put in money anywhere near the top, you've now lost half of your value. And if at any point that scares you, you're out. If you put in anything, not even that you need, but necessarily that you will miss if it goes away, you're right now panicking. And what do you do when you panic? You sell. And you sell at a loss. And to date, this is the only way you could actually lose money in Bitcoin to date, is if you sell while it's crashing at a loss. So it's very important for that reason to never put in anything that you can do it, psychologically speaking. But I think that we're still in the middle of the crash. And then after that, there will be another long period of time. It could be 6 months. It could be 4 or 5 years, where Bitcoin essentially does nothing for a very long time. And then it'll start, when you see it start to move up again. And actually, that's when I plan on publishing my paper is after I see it start moving up again and I sense we're nearing the next bull run, because then it'll have gone one complete cycle. Because everybody asks me, when are you going to publish, an up-to-date paper? And I don't have anything more to say right now. So I'm going to wait till it's at the next cycle and it's repeating itself, and I'll say exactly the same thing I did last time. Of course, again, I could be wrong. We'll see. But this, I'm interested to see what happens. Any other questions?
Do you think the introduction of institutional investors and the introduction of these derivatives that are now available on cryptocurrencies has amplified this particular cycle?
I think the introduction of everything, it amplifies everything. I mean, that's consequence of the user base growing. So you look at actually what I name these things. I did have other names for them. I chose the actual name of what you could buy when I named it, but I don't know these ones because I wasn't really watching for these. But this one I called Cyprus. This one I called China. Right? This one I call Wall Street. This one I call Main Street, and this one I call everyone. So that's basically well, keep in mind with that, this is the Wall Street bubble. I mean, this is when institutional investment finally started to dip a toe in. They didn't touch it before. So that's why we reached this scale. As for the changes in the pattern, I really don't see any reason for the pattern to change until we reach kind of an equilibrium. I don't know exactly what it's going to do after that, but I think, it'll be a lot less volatile toward the end. After it shakes all the way through, once it becomes a standard, it'll be as stable as a currency is today, like dollars or anything else. Yes?
Do you think the bottom of this will be 10x of what kind of the baseline was?
Well, not historically, no. No, the bottom of this is actually usually between 1x or 2x of the old peak.
Okay.
So that was $1,000. So keep in mind, we could see it drop all the way down to $2,000 to $5,000 in that range. I mean, and that to me wouldn't surprise me. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. So be careful out there. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.